In Pokemon, legendaries are probably the single most powerful group that the game has to offer. Dominating forces like Mewtwo, Lugia, and Rayquaza can make the game an absolute breeze. And then there are mythical Pokemon that are so rare and powerful that you typically can't even get them in the base game. But there is a third group that you can use on your journey, who are just as strong as mythical Pokemon, and even many actual legendaries. These are pseudo-legendaries, the strongest Pokemon that players can have somewhat easy access to in each generation. We have a total of 10 of these Pokemon to discuss today, but before we can get into them, we gotta do the YouTube stuff. So do me a favor, scroll down, make sure you are subscribed, and leave a like to let us know that you are enjoying this content. If you want more, we also have videos diving into legendary and mythical Pokemon as well that you can check out after this one, or you can leave your own suggestion for us to do in the comments below. With that all out of the way though, let's start by explaining just what a pseudo-legendary Pokemon is. Like mythical Pokemon, each pseudo-legendary has a base stat total of 600, making them so strong that they effectively feel like legendaries. They are pseudo-legendaries. However, that is largely where similarities with these groups end. Pseudos are 3-stage Pokemon, and almost all of them are dragon types that are very difficult to evolve. And while you can catch multiple of them like any other non-legendary Pokemon, they do tend to be extremely rare and hard to catch. On top of that, they are often very weak and difficult to use until they are fully evolved, which will happen at very high levels. And a perfect example of this is our first pseudo, Dragonite. This line of Pokemon includes Dratini, Dragonair, and Dragonite, as well as the newly announced Mega Dragonite. Dratini was actually a Pokemon that was so rare that people in the Pokemon world originally thought it was mythical until a whole colony of them was found living underwater. They continuously shed their skin as they grow longer and will make dens behind waterfalls in order to keep themselves hidden during this process. Once it becomes strong enough, it will transform into Dragonair and gain the ability to control and manipulate the weather by releasing the energy that it stores in the crystals on its neck and tail. Because of this, Dragonairs were often given tribute by agricultural communities, hoping to earn their blessing. Once they evolved into Dragonite, they gain intelligence equal to humans, often acting as a guardian on the sea, as they will guide shipwrecked crews back to the shore and save those who are drowning. Not only that, but their evolution also makes them stronger and faster, to the point where Dragonites are said to be able to circle the planet in just 16 hours. Fitting to a species thought to be mythical, Dragonite and their pre-evolutions are largely based on several myths from around the world. Both Dratini and Dragonair in particular are based on Ryu, while also taking inspiration from the Loch Ness Monster, with the idea of people being unsure if they truly exist or not. Dragonair specifically also seems to be connected to the Greek god Hermes, with wings on their head, similar to the helmet that he is famous for wearing, as well as having a large serpent-like body which matches the snakes on his caduceus staff. And we actually see these elements returning for Mega Dragonite. Dragonite himself, though, is more similar to a European-style dragon than a Chinese-inspired dragon like Dratini or Dragonair, though he is bipedal, which isn't super normal for dragons. As an idea of how difficult these Pokemon were to actually get back then, if you wanted to use a Dragonite in Generation 1, you would have to catch a Dratini, which you would mainly do by fishing with a Super Rod in the Safari Zone, and even then it was a pretty rare encounter. And remember, the Gen 1 games were released in a time before the internet was super available, so you'd have to find the Super Rod on your own, and then you'd have to try it in the Safari Zone. It's not exactly intuitive, and a lot of people just wouldn't know about it. Dragonite's most famous appearance in the series is probably that they were the ace Pokemon for the champion Lance in Gold and Silver, though. Despite some of his Dragonites being too low-leveled to have actually evolved yet, but whatever, cheaters gonna cheat. However, Lance also appeared as an Elite Four member in the Gen 1 games as well. If the player didn't catch their own Dragonite prior to encountering Lance, then this would actually be their first time encountering this line of Pokemon, as well as the Dragon type in general, creating a final challenge in the game before you take on Blue. They really just sprung a new type on you at the end of the game that was only weak to Ice and other dragons, and resisted all possible starters for that generation. But even if you managed to get your hands on one of these Pokemon, you'd start by working with a Dratini, which is just abysmal to use. It is slow, it is frail, and it barely learns any useful moves outside of rap shenanigans in Gen 1. And on top of that, they wouldn't evolve until level 30. For reference, your starters were getting ready to reach their final stage at that point. Even then, while Dragonair does look much cooler, they only receive a 20-point boost in each of their stats, so it isn't really a powerhouse. But if you could get them up to level 55, then they'd be picking up the flying type by finally evolving into Dragonite and becoming an absolute beast. However, that means that in the original games, you would be getting your Dragonite at about the time you reach the Elite Four, making Dratini and Dragonair effectively useless for most of your playthrough. Our next pseudo came in Generation 2 with Larvitar, Pupitar, and Tyranitar, who are notably one of the only two pseudo lines to not be dragon types. Not only that, but Tyranitar is a Pokemon that has never really been a notable ace Pokemon for any major trainer. They did appear on Blue's rematch team in Gen 3 and 4 though, starting with Larvitar, who is a rock ground type that is born deep underground. After birth, they will need to consume all of the soil above them so that they can reach the surface and regroup with their parents. These Pokemon are basically made to consume, and once they've devoured a large mountain worth of soil, they will hibernate and begin to grow, eventually becoming a Pupitar. At this stage, they have a defensive shell that is as hard as sheetrock, which you might imagine would slow it down. However, Pupitar remains fairly quick. By compressing and releasing gas within its body, it is able to propel itself forward like a jet, and despite essentially being a living cocoon, it is still strong enough to topple mountains. But this is far from their true strength. Once Pupitar becomes strong enough, it will evolve into Tyranitar, dropping its ground typing in exchange for becoming a rock dark type instead, while also growing into one of the most dangerous Pokemon in the series. Tyranitar's body is so durable that it cannot be harmed, and also has so much raw strength that it can create earthquakes that will crumble mountains with a single hand, or completely bury rivers with ease, often requiring maps to be redrawn as a result. They are Pokemon literally known for changing the landscape, as well as for their overwhelming need to battle strong opponents. But even this isn't the end, as Tyranitar can Mega Evolve, causing their back to split open and leaving them only controlled by their destructive instincts. Even their trainer's orders might not be able to get through to them once they become a Mega Tyranitar. This entire line is actually based on the idea of a larva growing into a kaiju, specifically one that seems to be inspired by the armadillo-girdled lizard. Tyranitar is a fairly strange Pokemon in general though, even in terms of pseudo-legendaries. While many of these Pokemon are powerful options which you can put in hard work to be able to use against the Elite Four, Tyranitar is completely unable to be used until both Johto and Kanto's Elite Four have been defeated, though you could technically use him against Red as you catch Larvitar at Mount Silver. That said, Tyranitar also stands out as a Dark-type Pokemon. This type was introduced in Generation 2, so it makes sense that the most powerful Pokemon of the generation would highlight it. But like just about all of the other Dark types in these games, it is essentially unusable in your playthrough. However, unlike Murkrow, Houndour, and Sneasel, Tyranitar actually has some decent power to it once you get access to it. In terms of gameplay, the Tyranitar line functions a lot like Dragonite. Larvitar shares the same BST as Dratini, Pupitar is nearly the same as Dragonair, and the evolution levels for both remain to be 30 and 55. However, Larvitar has a much more usable move pool, which makes the process of actually leveling them up significantly easier. Not that you were able to get it early enough for that to matter though. As for Tyranitar themselves, they are a pretty slow Pokemon, but with some solid defenses and health as well as pretty high attack to still be a real threat. Add in Sandstream to whip up a Sandstorm to boost their special defenses, and it is a hard to kill Weather Setter that hits like a truck, making it a pretty useful Pokemon overall. Tyranitar also went on to inspire the future Paradox Pokemon Iron Thorns, which is a rock electric type from 1 billion years in the future. They are fairly comparable to Tyranitar as far as stats, though it is a bit faster with weaker special stats. That said, losing the dark typing takes an immunity away, and having Quark Drive rather than Sandstream makes team building feel similar, but definitely distinct. With that, we can head into Generation 3, which added 2 pseudo-legendary Pokemon. The first of which dips into the other new type from the previous generation, being Steel, and is the only pseudo aside from Tyranitar to not be a dragon type. The Steel Psychic Metagross line is an absolute monster, even among pseudo-legendaries, which is probably why the region's champion, Steven Stone, used it as their ace. This line includes Beldum, Metang, and Metagross, as well as their Mega Evolution. Now, as fantastic as Metagross is, they are probably the single most miserable pseudo to get a hold of, largely because of Beldum. You see, the Metagross line are the only Pokemon to have the same catch rate as legendary and mythical Pokemon. But what makes it even worse is that Beldum's only move in early generations was Takedown, so it was a very rare encounter with the lowest catch rate possible, who will slowly knock itself out with recoil damage. That said, as of Generation 8 though, Takedown has been replaced in the Learn set by Tackle as Beldum's only move. Luckily though, in Generation 3 we would be given a Beldum by Steven without needing to actually catch one for ourselves. But unfortunately this only happens after defeating the Elite Four, so you can't really use it in your playthrough. Even so, these Pokemon are very cool. Beldum has a magnetic force that runs through its body rather than blood, which allows it to send out pulses to communicate with other Beldum that it comes across in the wild. This same magnetic energy repels Beldum from the earth and allows it to float, but as a result it does need to anchor itself to a cliff if it wants to take a nap. Now, to make up for Beldum's non-existent move pool, they actually evolve much earlier than other pseudo-legendaries, becoming a Metang at level 20. This happens when two Beldum fuse together and link their magnetic nervous systems. In doing so, their abilities are enhanced, and Metang gains psychokinetic powers. This also allows Metang to propel itself at speeds up to 60 miles per hour through the air as it hunts nose passes through mountain ranges. But it isn't just fast, it's also incredibly durable as well, with the Pokédex noting that even if it collides with a jet, Metang will come out without a scratch. Metang is then able to combine with more Beldum at level 45, and with 4 brains coming together they evolve into Metagross, becoming able to think as fast as a supercomputer. With its incredible intelligence and powerful body, Metagross will analyze and exploit their prey's weaknesses, allowing them to pin their targets down and devour them with the mouth on their stomach. This intelligence and strength are pushed even further when Metagross Mega evolves, which allows them to defeat nearly every opponent. And even if a Mega Metagross is overpowered, they will simply wrap their limbs around their target and self-destruct as a last resort. Now, something that you might not know about Metagross is that it's based on more than just a robotic spider. It's actually a reference to the Antikythera mechanism, which was a hand-powered model of the solar system. As for Generation 3's second pseudo line, we finally return to Dragon types with Bagon, Shelgon, Salamence, and Mega Salamence, who were the ace Pokemon for trainers like Drake in the Hoenn Elite Four and Zinnia from Oraz. Bagon is a small Dragon-type Pokemon who dreamed of soaring through the air despite not having wings. It would continuously throw itself from high cliffs as it tried to learn to fly, but would always come crashing to the ground. Out of frustration, it began to bash its head against huge rocks and shatter them into pebbles. However, over time, the repeated hits to their head has made Bagon's head as durable as tempered steel. When they reach level 30, Bagon will evolve into Shelgon. The thick padding on their head will spread to surround their entire body, becoming a dense, bone-like cocoon that can protect them from any attack. While the shell keeps the Pokemon safe, it comes at a pretty significant cost, making it slow and nearly immobile, to the point where they often don't even eat or drink anything while they're in this form, remaining perfectly still while their cells inside the shell experience intense changes. Once it's ready at level 50, the Pokemon will evolve once again, this time into Salamence. Bagon quite literally willed their wings into existence and gained the flying type as a result. However, even after achieving their dream, Salamence is still a very temperamental Pokemon, and if angered it will go on uncontrollable rampages, destroying everything in range with its claws and its flames. From scorching fields to ashes to crushing mountains, nothing is safe when an angry Salamence is involved. This gets even worse when it Mega evolves, as when it does, their wings experience severe stress and merge together into a crescent shape. The pain involved in this process can make Salamence go wild. However, this form does give them access to even greater speeds. By tucking their arms into their shell, it can become more aerodynamic and allows them to fly through the air at unbelievable speeds. Much like the Metagross line, you needed to wait pretty far into Gen 3 games to gain access to Salamence, though you could get them before the Elite Four in this case by going deep into Meteor Falls. And they are definitely worth picking up, as Salamence is kind of the sweeper when it comes to early pseudos. With powerful abilities like Intimidate and Moxie, along with a fantastic learn set, it is just about a perfect offensive threat that can be used to clean up the battlefield. Salamence also acted to inspire their prehistoric Paradox counterpart Roaring Moon, who looks like a feathered version of Mega Salamence. With that, we can head to Generation 4 with the next pseudo line, Gible, Gabite, Garchomp, and Mega Garchomp, the iconic partner Pokemon of the champion Cynthia. These Landshark Pokemon are all dragon and ground types with razor-sharp fins across their body. Gible will make their nest in small holes in cave walls and prefers to live in tropical and warm environments to stay out of the cold. They will bite just about anything in front of them with so much force that they will sometimes chip their own teeth, though luckily they are able to grow them back within just a few days. While these Pokemon can definitely be dangerous, they are also extremely clumsy and will tend to hurt themselves when acting without thinking. Gible is actually the earliest that we have access to a pseudo line in the early games, and could be caught in the first basement floor of the Wayward Cave in Gen 4. Not only that, but they have the earliest evolutions as well, becoming a Gabite at just level 24. After evolving, Gabite trades their habit of biting things for a habit of collecting instead, specifically looking for shiny objects, gems, and sometimes even collecting Carbink to fill up their hoard of treasure in their nest. This, unfortunately, will often make them the target of thieves who will try to take the jewels that Gabites have collected. But that isn't the only thing that these Pokemon are targeted for, as there is also an old wives' tale about Gabite scales being used in medicines that can cure nearly any disease. And this constant harassment is something that Gabite keeps with them long after evolving into Garchomp at level 48. They are so angry and resentful that they will chase down any prey for as long as it takes to ensure they don't survive. Not that the chase will last very long, as Garchomp can fly at the speed of sound, and when it does, the fins on its arms will create blades of wind that can slice through trees with ease. It will use this to dive into flocks of bird Pokemon, taking them out before swallowing them whole. Even hiding isn't going to save you against a Garchomp, as the growths on their head act as sensors, which they can use to track their prey over large distances. When exposed to Garchompite, they will also evolve into Mega Garchomp, shifting their arm fins into powerful scythes, a process which is so painful that it blinds the Pokemon with rage and causes them to attack wildly. While a normal Garchomp is fairly fast for a Pokemon that has this much health and attack, Mega Garchomp trades some of that speed in exchange for an even further boost to their defenses and offenses. This results in a massive 170 in attack, which is great, but of the 100 points allocated through Mega Evolution, 40 of them are wasted for special attack. And losing speed and the ability to hold items is a pretty big drawback for that trade, making Mega Garchomp one of the few Megas that are often considered to be a downgrade from the original. As for their design, Garchomp pulls inspiration from several things, from sharks to wyverns. However, the biggest source is the Curtis P40 Warhawk Fighter Jet, a plane made popular by their shark-themed nose art and the nickname the Desert Sharks. While Generation 4 gave us the most accessible pseudo to date, Gen 5 gave us not only one of the hardest pseudos to evolve, but one of the hardest Pokemon to evolve. The Dark Dragon Hydreigon line, including Dino, Zweilous, and Hydreigon, are known for their absurdly high evolution levels of 50 and 64. For reference, by the time the Dino evolves into a Zweilous, it will be the same level as the Ace Pokemon for the Elite Four, and when it evolves again, it will be nearly on par with their upgraded rematch teams. Luckily, you don't get access to Dino until Victory Road anyways, but it just about guarantees that you won't be using this in the Elite Four as a result. Notably, a level 64 evolution puts this at 9 levels higher than any Pokemon that evolves from previous generations. But, to be fair, this is kind of a theme in Unova, with many Pokemon, including Larvesta, Rufflet, Vullaby, Pawniard, Mienfoo, Clang, Fracture, and Vanillish all having very high level requirements from 40 to 59 to evolve. They just really didn't want us having final stage Pokemon in this generation. Back to Dino though, this Pokemon is known for their brash decision making, biting anything that it can find and often putting itself in danger, which results in scars that cover its body. This is because Dino can't actually see, so it is forced to navigate the world by tackling and biting its surroundings. This is made into an even bigger requirement as they tend to live deep in caves where food is scarce. But once it does bite something that it likes the taste of, Dino will remember the scent of that thing and be able to find it in the future. But life doesn't get any easier once they evolve into a Zweilous. It grows a second head with its own personality that does not get along with the original, and the two of them will fight over every piece of food that they come across. The Pokedex in Violet suggests that because these heads are always at each other's throats, they don't really need a trainer to become stronger and more battle-hardened. Despite their constant arguing, Zweilous will eventually hunt their territory until no food remains before moving on to another area, the whole time fighting itself over which head gets to eat. And that might seem strange as they both share a stomach, however, it becomes very important when it becomes time to evolve. When becoming a Hydreigon, whichever Zweilous head has eaten more food will become the leader of their new form. This is the only head that will retain their personality, while the other will become one of two secondary heads controlled by the single remaining brain. That said, the main brain is incredibly intelligent, but it will only use that wisdom solely for thinking of ways to destroy their surroundings. Anything that it sees move will immediately be attacked, and anything that doesn't move will either be consumed or crushed into dust. With its 6 wings, this Pokemon is even able to take to the sky now, vastly expanding its territory and its hunting grounds. Hydreigon is such a destructive force of nature that ancient civilizations considered them to be evil incarnate, sent to bring an end to whichever area they visited, which is probably why we saw Hydreigon be the ace Pokemon to Ghetsis, the evil leader of Team Plasma. Now, Hydreigon is a bit of an interesting case for pseudo-legendaries, as they are the first special attacker in the bunch. However, in general, this Pokemon has just pretty decent stats across the board. Honestly, of all the pseudos, this one feels most similar to a mythical stat spread to me personally, with all their stats kind of floating around that 100 mark, but having a bit of a boost to their special attack. They're just kind of a jack of all trades that's very effective and versatile. In terms of design, this line might look a bit goofy, however they are definitely some of the most intricately designed Pokemon to date. At their core, Hydreigon is based on the Yamada no Orochi, a multi-headed serpent from Japanese myth, with the Pokemon's hands and wings meant to represent the 8 heads of the Orochi. This multi-headed theme extends to their name as well, with the Hy part coming from the Greek Hydra. Meanwhile, the names of Dino, Zweilous, and Hydreigon are also named for the German word for their number of heads, being eins, zwei, and drei, or 1, 2, and 3, respectively. Then there's the tread-like marks across Hydreigon's body, which are remnants from an early design where these Pokemon were more heavily based on tanks. And on top of all of that, you have these false heads working as hands, which are fittingly designed to look almost like hand puppets. Even the level that this Pokemon evolves is a reference, as 1964 was the year that the 5th Godzilla movie was released, that being Ghidorah, the 3-headed monster. It is just all around a really cool Pokemon that is well put together. And of course, Hydreigon also served as the inspiration for the future Paradox Pokemon, Iron Jugulis, dropping the Dragon typing for a Flying type instead. This, along with having lowered defenses, makes Iron Jugulis much more frail than Hydreigon, as they also lose a ton of resistances with that typing. However, it does pick up a bit of speed in exchange, but even so, like Iron Thorns, I just think this is a bit of a downgrade overall, though again, not a terrible Pokemon by any means. But with Generation 6 came the end of Dragon-type supremacy. Every Pokemon we've talked about so far, with the exception of Metagross, and all of the Pokemon we're going to be talking about, suddenly had to compete with Fairy types, making them much less reliable as sweepers. Which might be why this generation was the first to introduce a truly defensive pseudo-legendary with the Goodra line, Goomy, Sliggoo, and Goodra. Interestingly, Goodra was not an ace Pokemon for any major trainers in Kalos, but they did appear on the champion Diantha's team and was one of Ash's strongest Pokemon in the anime as well. And as a quick aside, Goomy is objectively one of the best Pokemon designs the series has ever had. Look at this little dude, 10 out of 10, no notes. Despite this, the Pokédex refers to Gumi as the weakest Dragon-type Pokémon, being so vulnerable that it needs to live in dark and damp places so that its slimy body doesn't dry out. This slimy membrane that surrounds it is actually incredibly important to Gumi, as it causes attacks to slide right off of it without them taking damage. Anything that touches this Pokemon will be covered and slowed down by its goo, giving it a natural repellent to attackers. However, if anything does go in to actually attack and grabs Gumi's horns, they will go into shock and become unable to move. This is because their horns act to cover all 5 of Gumi's senses and are so sensitive that they can sense movement through the air to become aware of threats. From here, we have an entirely unique mechanic among pseudos, a split evolution. Depending on if they are in Hisui or not, Gumi will either evolve into a normal or Hisuian Sliggoo at level 40, with the latter picking up the steel typing for the rest of the line, while the original remains a pure dragon type all the way through. As Sliggoo, the ooze around their body becomes much more acidic, to the point where it can dissolve anything, melting everything in range so that Sliggoo can eat it. Unfortunately, this acid also melts its own eyes, which leaves the Pokemon blind. However, it now has 4 horns rather than 2, which essentially allows it to have a built-in radar system created through scent and sound. Then, if Sliggoo reaches level 50 in the rain, they will evolve once again, this time into Goodra. Finally able to see the world around them once again, Goodra becomes an incredibly friendly and loving Pokemon that will often hug their trainers and cover them in slime, though it does seem less acidic now and doesn't hurt the trainer. Despite that, it is stronger than ever. A combination of its slime and fatty body makes most attacks against it pretty irrelevant. Meanwhile, Goodra themselves can throw punches with the force of 100 pro boxers, or swat things away with a tail so powerful that it can send dump trucks flying. That can make them pretty dangerous, as when angered they will go on uncontrollable rampages. Conversely, if they are left alone for a long time, Goodra will become overwhelmed by loneliness and begin releasing gooey tears. As for the Hisuian variants, the mucus around Sliggoo will react to the water in Hisui's water and form a metallic shell which it can use to defend itself. When they evolve to Hisuian Goodra, they gain the ability to freely control the hardness of that shell, making it an extremely resilient Pokemon as a result. However, this version of Goodra is much more sensitive to being alone. It hates isolation so much that if it is ever left alone for even a short time, it will begin to riot. Both versions of Goodra are defensive monsters with 150 in special defense. However, the normal form has a much lower physical defense stat. Meanwhile, the Hisuian form trades a little bit of speed and health to bring that defense up to a respectable 100, which in combination with the new steel typing can make them feel like an insurmountable wall sometimes, especially if you take the shell armor ability into consideration. That said, Goodra also had their own signature ability as well, Gooey, which slows down enemy attackers who make physical contact with Goodra. This ability is exclusive to the Goodra line, or at least it was until it was given to both Wiglet and Wugtrio in later generations. As for the design inspiration, Goodra largely comes from the Loup-Carcole, a mythical mollusk from French folklore, as well as the Shusebora, a yokai snail from Japanese myth that will live for 3,000 years in its shell before transforming into a dragon. And that brings us to Generation 7's dragon fighting Pokemon, Kommo-o. This line includes Jangmo-o, Hakumo-o, and Kommo-o. They are the first pseudo-legendaries to this point to not have any variants in any way, shape, or form, be they Paradox, Mega, or Split evolutions, which will continue as we head both into Generation 8 and 9 as well. On top of that, Kommo-o only really appears as an ace Pokemon in Alola's Pokemon League title defense match against Ryuki, though they also make an appearance in Nemona's team in Generation 9. Jangmo-o's fur is so thick that it becomes as hard as metal, forming scales that it will clang together to communicate with others or to frighten or intimidate their opponents. They live in isolation deep in the vast Pony Canyon, far away from humanity, where they will often battle one another to become stronger. They are extremely proud on the battlefield, refusing to show their backs to their opponents, which had earned them the respect of ancient Alolan warriors in the past. At level 35, they evolve into Hakumo-o, shedding and regrowing their scales on a regular basis and becoming harder and sharper each time they do. people will actually take these scales that they shed and mold and repurpose them into pots and pans as they conduct heat extremely well. Kommo-o will strike its scales and dance in preparation for battle before leaping towards their opponents with an intimidating scream and unleashing punches until their target is literally torn to shreds. Finally, at level 45, they become Kommo-o, a Pokemon so feared and obsessed with battle that the clanging of their scales will cause weaker species to immediately run away. While Hakumo-o's scales were taken away and remade into kitchenware, Kommo-o's are strong enough to be forged into weapons. But even while they are on the Pokemon, they are a source of dominating offense and defense. Over time, they have become hard as steel, and Kommo-o will use this hardness to launch brutal supercuts at blinding speeds, which can send their opponents flying. And once they've defeated their targets, they will strike the scales on their body to release a loud sound in celebration that lets their comrades know they have won. In battle, Kommo-o is known to use their signature attack, Clanging Scales. This inflicts some solid damage, but reduces the user's defense by 1 stage. On top of that, as a sound-based move, it will bypass things like Substitute. Then, if Kommo-o is holding the Commonium Z, this can be upgraded to the Z move, Clangorous Soul Blaze, a move that damages all opponent Pokemon and increases the user's attack, defense, special attack, special defense, and speed by 1 stage, making it an absolutely crazy setup move, making Kommo-o pretty dangerous if it can get this thing off. This Pokemon is largely inspired by the pangolin, while replacing their scaly hide for symbol-like fur. It also draws inspiration from the shape-shifting Hawaiian dragon called the Mo-o. However, its tail was made to look like a monk's staff, or a kakara. Leaving Alola and moving on to Generation 8, we have the ghostly dragon pseudos, Dreepy, Dracloak, and Dragapult. While not a major trainer's ace Pokemon in their generation, Dragapult did appear on the champion Leon's team, as well as Gita's rematch team in later generations. Dreepy spends its days zipping around over the ocean at high speeds, playfully poking at aquatic Pokemon like Clauncher. It does this even though it won't eat these Pokemon, which is a bit of an odd behavior that acts as a remnant from its past life in the prehistoric seas, when Dreepy was still alive. Alone, Dreepy is incredibly weak. The Pokedex flat out says that even a child could beat one in a fight, but with friends to help train it, it can begin to grow. At level 50, Dreepy evolves into Dracloak, a much faster and more capable fighter that will become a caretaker to a Dreepy who hitches a ride on its head. Dracloak flies at over 120 miles per hour, battling alongside its passenger until the little one is strong enough to evolve itself. If a Dracloak loses in battle, the Dreepy who rides it will wander off alone, leaving Dracloak so uneasy that it will try to put any Pokemon it finds onto its head just to feel secure again. Finally, at level 60, Dracloak becomes a Dragapult, one of the fastest Pokemon in the series and an absolute terror to deal with. Outside of battle, it shelters its Dreepies in the holes on its horns, but once the battle starts, it literally launches them like ghostly draconic missiles at supersonic speed. Luckily, the Dreepy actually enjoy being used as rockets, eagerly waiting for their turn to be fired once again. Dragapult can also turn completely invisible by focusing its mind, and is even able to cloak the Dreepy that are with it as well. Over time, the fastest Dragapults will be surrounded by flocks of Dreepy who are desperate for a high-speed joyride. Fitting to all of this, Dragapult has an extremely high speed stat of 142, as well as solid offenses to make use of that, though their defenses are a bit below average. And of course, Dragapult has their signature move, Dragon Darts, which features it launching Dreepies at its opponent. In terms of design, Dragapult largely comes from the extinct animal Diplocalus, which is where that boomerang-shaped head comes from. However, this is transformed a little bit to look more like a stealth bomber as well. And our final pseudo-legendary is the Dragon Ice Baxcalibur line, including Frigibax, Arctibax, and Baxcalibur, which we saw being used by the Dragon-type Elite Four member Hassel. The line begins with Frigibax, a Pokemon that lives in forests and rocky crags, who will absorb heat through the dorsal fin on their back and convert that heat into icy energy, ironically meaning that the hotter the environment that this Pokemon finds themselves in, the more power it can store. Frigibax will even use that fin to keep the inside of its nest chilled, like a living refrigerator. At level 35, they will evolve into Arctibax, a more aggressive predator whose dorsal fin transforms into a deadly blade of ice. It protects its face with a mask made out of frost while using acrobatic flips to slash opponents mid-air, making use of their powerful legs to move quickly through the battlefield. Then at level 54, Arctobax will evolve into Baxcalibur, a Pokemon that launches itself into the sky and spews freezing air from its mouth to freeze opponents in place before slicing right through them. This icy breath is so potent that it can even freeze lava instantaneously. To demonstrate this Pokemon's power, it has both a unique move and ability. Glaive Rush is a high-risk, high-reward ice move that hits for a ton of damage, but makes it so that the opponent will always hit their next attack, and it will do double damage in exchange. Meanwhile, Thermal Exchange boosts Baxcalibur's attack when it's hit by a Fire-type move, and prevents it from being burned. And this is pretty important, as Baxcalibur already has a pretty high attack stat, as well as solid HP and defense for survivability. Not to mention, while it doesn't have fantastic speed, it isn't the slowest Pokemon around either, making it fairly well-rounded overall. Baxcalibur's design comes from that classic kaiju idea and Godzilla-style look, which, like Hydreigon, actually shares a reference to the Godzilla series in its evolution level, as 1954 was the year that the Godzilla film was released. Meanwhile, the icy blade-like sail on its back is a reference to King Arthur's sword in the stone, Excalibur, obviously also inspiring the Pokemon's name as well. But with that, we have covered all of these pseudo-legendaries. I think my favorite definitely comes down to either Metagross or Dragapult, but let me know what your favorites are in the comments down below. And as always, if you enjoyed, remember to leave a like and subscribe for more content in the future. Plus, if you want to check out our videos on the actual legendary Pokemon or mythicals, you can click those links on screen now. With all that being said, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.